Warriors are feeling very strong in the War Within and have been really fun to play. They manage incoming damage really well by mitigating a large portion of it and deal a ton of damage in the process. You feel like a brick wall, being able to handle most situations easily while only managing a few key abilities, which is great for tanks. The better a tank feels to play, the more people play them, and the more tanks we have. Today we're going to talk about each offensive and defensive cooldown Warriors have, their rotations, and key interactions with talents. So let's get into it with defensive cooldowns. Our primary defensive cooldown is Shield Wall. Shield Wall is a great ability that reduces incoming damage by 40% for 8 seconds. It does have a 3.5 minute cooldown, but don't worry too much about that. There's a lot of cooldown reduction through Shield Slam that turns that cooldown into only about a minute and a half. This is a very strong CD you can use very frequently. Make sure to get good, consistent use of Shield Wall. Next, we've got Last Stand. Last Stand is typically the weaker of our defensive cooldowns, with it only increasing our health by 30% and healing us for that amount. It doesn't reduce any incoming damage, meaning this can feel more like a quick heal rather than something you use to mitigate damage going into a pull. With a 3-minute cooldown, it's not something that's up frequently, but can be a nice self-heal when you need it. Moving on, we've got Spell Block. Spell Block is a great way to alleviate a big weakness in Warriors, magic damage. Warriors have always been the strongest against physical damage while being fairly weak against magic. However, with Spell Block you can now block incoming spells, significantly increasing their survivability against casters. Warriors typically block about 50% of physical damage, and being able to block that amount of incoming magic damage is huge for Warriors. With a minute and a half cooldown, you can get a lot of value with this when going into caster heavy packs. Following Spell Block, let's talk about Spell Reflect. Spell Reflect allows you to reflect spells. Shocker. It is very strong in certain situations and can often make up a large portion of damage on certain boss fights and even some trash pulls. It has a very short cooldown, making it something you can use consistently to send some damage back at casters. But even if you can't reflect the spells, it does have an additional use. Spell Reflect reduces magic damage taken by 25% for 5 seconds. That's a massive magic damage reduction on an extremely short cooldown, especially since the cooldown begins when you cast, not when the buff drops off. So you can get this ability down to about a 15-second cooldown, which is honestly pretty insane for a magic DR that strong. Lastly, let's talk about Demoralizing Shout. Demo Shout reduces all damage enemies within 15 yards deal to you by 25% for 8 seconds. When talented into Strength of the Mountain and Booming Voice, this jumps to 30% damage reduction, generates 30 rage, and increases the damage you deal to the targets affected by 20%. All of that on a 45-second cooldown. And if you talent into Thunderlord, then each enemy hit by Thunderclap reduces the cooldown of Demo Shout by 1.5 seconds, up to a total of 4.5 seconds each cast, meaning each Thunderclap in a pack can reduce the cooldown by 4.5 seconds, turning this 45-second cooldown into only about 20 to 25 seconds. This is a great ability to use consistently to reduce incoming damage from pull to pull, but it can also be used as a defensive CD against tank busters on bosses if Shield Wall is not available. It's about 10% less of a damage reduction than Shield Wall, but you have it up so often that it can be used in a pinch in place of Shield Wall. Next, let's get into offensive cooldowns. Our primary offensive cooldown is Avatar. Avatar transforms you into a Colossus for 20 seconds, causing you to deal 20% increased damage, removing all roots and snares, and generates 10 rage. Avatar has a 1.5 minute cooldown, but is reduced by 1 second for every 10 rage you spend thanks to the anger management talent, making Avatar come off cooldown very quickly, meaning you can pretty much send it as soon as it's available, provided the pull isn't ending soon. You want to have as much uptime on Avatar as possible. Next, we've got Ravager. Ravager throws a whirling weapon at the target location that chases nearby enemies, inflicting physical damage to all enemies over 12 seconds. Additionally, it generates 10 rage per hit. So there's 2 things we want to look at with Ravager. One is that it does big damage to a pack and is a great way to kick things off going into a pull. It also chases nearby enemies, meaning if you have to move slightly, you'll see Ravager start to follow a pack, which is really good when you have ground clutter and need to move. It doesn't move very quickly, but you do see it gravitate towards the pack if you have to move a little. Secondly, it generates 10 rage each time it deals damage. When used on a large pack, Ravager pumps out rage and lets you dump a ton into Ignore Pain, Shield Block, and even Revenge because of how much rage you're generating. This is a really fantastic ability that you can send as often as you can, especially if you're going into a pack low on rage. Lastly, we have Champion Spear. Throw a spear at the target location, dealing physical damage instantly and an additional chunk of damage over 4 seconds. Enemies hit are chained to the spear's location for the duration. Now this ability is mainly just a use on cooldown damage ability that generates a bit of rage, but can be used in certain situations to help control a pack. Because of that last part, enemies hit are chained to the spear's location for the duration. In most scenarios, when you pull a pack, they're going to stay with you, and this doesn't really have an effect on the pull. But there are packs, for example in Necrotic Wake, that have mobs that are jumping up and down and in and out, and this ability is a great way to lock that pack in place long enough for your DPS to get some good shots in on them before they start jumping around again. It's also really good in the first pull of Mist. Being able to lock down the jumpers for a short duration and maybe chaining it with the stun can let your DPS get into position or start blasting. Alright, now that we've talked about some offensive and defensive cooldowns, let's talk about your rotation from pack to pack. Rotations are an odd thing to look at for a tank because you don't typically have a set rotation, you have more priority moves. And because every pull is different, you kind of need to use your best instinct. But what we're going to talk about is the key parts of a warrior's rotation. Warriors are centered around using builders to generate rage and using your spenders to dump rage. You never want to cap on rage, so it becomes a balance of floating on the higher end of it, making sure you always have enough to use any of your spenders in a pinch, but you're also not overcapping if you use a builder. So let's talk about our builders first. There are really only two main builders, Thunderclap and Shield Slam. First, we've got Thunderclap. Now, Thunderclap is a simple AoE ability that generates rage, but some things to know about Thunderclap is it has a ton of interactions with your talents. Strategist gives it a chance to reset the cooldown of Shield Slam. Thunderlord reduces the cooldown on Demoralizing Shout. It casts Rend on all targets hit. Seismic Reverberation means if it hits 3 or more enemies, it hits them a second time for 30% damage. And during Avatar, its damage is increased by 50%. On top of all of that, you also have even more interaction with the Mountain Thane hero trait. Lightning Strike means damaging enemies with Thunderclap gives a chance to hit one target with a Lightning Strike. Crashing Thunders increases its damage by 40%. Thunder Blast causes your Shield Slam to have a chance to turn your next Thunderclap into Thunder Blast, which deals 40% increased damage as Storm Strike damage and generates 10 rage instead of 5. Lastly, Avatar will now grant 2 charges of Thunder Blast and reset the cooldown of Thunderclap, meaning as soon as you go into Avatar, you have 2 big damage Thunderclaps coming your way. So this seemingly simple ability has a ton of different things working with it to make it stronger, make it generate more rage, and overall improve the ability. With all of this and it being a primary builder, you're slamming this on cooldown unless you're going to cap on rage. Next, we've got Shield Slam. Shield Slam is a single target ability that deals damage and generates about 20 rage. Again, it's a simple builder with a lot of talent interaction. Impenetrable Wall causes your Shield Slam to reduce the cooldown of Shield Wall by 6 seconds each time you cast it. Brace for Impact causes it to have a stacking buff that each time you use it, it increases the damage of Shield Slam by 5% for 16 seconds and can stack 5 times, meaning you can build the buff up and get some really strong Shield Slams. Strategist can reset the cooldown on Shield Slam, making it come off CD quite often. Punish causes Shield Slam to apply a debuff that reduces the damage the target deals to you by 2% and can stack. Heavy Repercussions causes your Shield Slam to extend the duration of Shield Block by 1 second, making Shield Block much easier to maintain. Additionally, into the Mountain Thane tree you have Burst of Power, which can proc to cause your next 2 Shield Slams to have no cooldown. So you have a lot of talents that are working with your main builders to kind of amplify each one, and each one works with the other. So Shield Slam has a chance to make Thunderclap stronger by making it Thunder Blast. Thunderclap has a chance to reset the cooldown of Shield Slam, and they work back and forth and create this really good synergy that makes it very smooth to play. Next, let's cover your spenders. First, let's talk about your primary maintenance buff, Shield Block. Shield Block guarantees you're blocking incoming physical hits and is something you should aim to have up as much as possible. You can do this by casting Shield Block, but thanks to the champion's Bulwark talent, you can also use Shield Charge to generate a cast of Shield Block. This early into the expansion, with how low our haste is, it can be tough to maintain high uptime on Shield Block, but having Shield Charge essentially be a third charge of Shield Block makes it a little bit easier. Also, you have Heavy Repercussions, which, as I mentioned before, gives you an extra second of Shield Block every time you Shield Slam. And that, coupled with all the talents to give you Shield Slam more often, make it a really strong talent and really helps maintain Shield Block much easier this early into the expansion. Now let's talk about Ignore Pain. Ignore Pain is going to be your primary way to dump rage, as it's not on the global cooldown and can be sent at any time. Ignore Pain gives you a shield that reduces the damage you take by 50% for the duration of the shield. The amount of shield you get with each use is based on attack power, and the total shield you can get is 30% of your health. So you can use it and then use it again, and it stacks and creates a bigger shield up to 30%. Like I said before, this is your primary way to dump rage. As you're building the shield up, you're taking damage and reducing the shield as well, meaning you can consistently be spending rage on Ignore Pain and getting value out of each cast. Ignore Pain is a very safe bet when you're not sure what to spend rage on. If you're near cap and you don't know what to spend it on Ignore Pain. Maintaining the shield it generates means less damage taken, which is always a good thing. Lastly, for spenders, we've got Revenge. Revenge is a very strong offensive ability and you do use it, but you need to make sure you're not sacrificing other key spenders first. You want to make sure shield block is up and running, Ignore Pain has a comfortable amount of shield or is not needed in the current situation, and then you can Revenge. You can also always send Revenge when you get the free proc because you're not wasting any rage on it, so that's okay to do. I know everyone wants to deal damage and it can feel really good to hit Revenge on big packs, but you want to make sure you're not finding yourself empty on rage from spamming it and now you need to shield block or Ignore Pain and you can't do it. Knowing which spender to use is what's going to make or break you as a tank. If your shield block is falling off, you're going to want to make sure you refresh it as soon as you can. You also don't want to cap on charges, so if by some chance you have shield block up and it's about to cap on charges, you can just send it. If you cast shield block while you already have one up, it simply adds to the duration of it, meaning you don't need it to fall off before you cast it again. Ignore Pain, as I mentioned before, is your primary rage dump. You can consistently be building up your shield as damage is wearing it down, and because it caps at 30% of your total health, it means you have a lot of room to build it. And if you're taking consistent damage, you typically don't have to worry about hitting that cap. You want to be sure you're not dumping all of your rage, however, and are weaving builders in between Ignore Pain cast. If you blow through all your rage with Ignore Pain, you may not have enough rage for shield block when you need it. It's a dance between generating and spending that as you become better at the dance, you'll become better at tanking on a warrior. Revenge is the ability you cast when you get a free proc or you're about to cap and have nothing else to spend it on. You may not need Ignore Pain in the current situation, you already have shield block up, and Thunderclap or Shield Slam could be on CD or will overcap you on rage. If that's the case, then you can send Revenge. You can also hit Revenge early on into a pack to generate some threat to make sure you don't lose anything, but after that, it's typically your last resort. Now let's talk about some little tips for warriors, some tricks. 1. Spell Reflect. Spell Reflect is a very strong ability that people need to be using as much as they can and trying to reflect as many spells as they can. There's a list of spells that can be reflected in the Warrior Discord that is a great resource for knowing what you can send back at the caster. It does a ton of damage if you reflect the right spell and can be a big part of your overall damage. For example, the first boss in City of Threads has a tank buster, Subjugate, that you can spell reflect. With its short cooldown, you can reflect almost every Subjugate and get huge value out of it throughout the entire fight. Shield Wall, as I mentioned, has a long CD on paper, but with all the shield slams you're getting through procs and cooldown resets, and each one of them is reducing the cooldown of Shield Wall, it has more like a minute and a half CD, meaning don't be afraid to send Shield Wall often as it comes off cooldown very quickly. Avatar is another cooldown reduced by rage spent. Every 10 rage you spend reduces its cooldown by 1 second, meaning a full 130 rage bar is dropping your 90-second cooldown by 13 seconds, meaning you can blast through this cooldown fairly quickly if you are properly building and spending rage, and then you can get right into your next use of Avatar. High level is typically what you go for on most characters until it becomes close enough for stats to factor in, and that's probably more of a factor on gear for warriors because higher eye level items gives more armor, which actually translates into strength as well, which also translates into parry, meaning the strength on your gear isn't your only resource of strength, armor is too. So that higher eye level is giving you even more strength than you might see at face value. Overall, warriors are extremely strong right now. They deal very good damage, they mitigate a ton of damage, and their weaknesses aren't as prominent in the War Within as they have been in the past. There isn't a lot of rot damage or giant magic damage that you can't handle in the current Mythic Plus dungeons. I hope this guide broke down warriors a little bit more for you and helped you guys learn a little bit. And as always, till next time, guys.